We're bringing you boots on the ground insight from the ranchers, conservationists, and partners who are helping to preserve the best of the Golden State for generations to come. Join the California Rangeland Trust for inspiring stories of resilience, innovation, and hope as we get tuned into the land.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Tune Into the Land. I'm your host and CEO of the California Rangeland Trust, Michael Delbar. When social media first came onto the scene, it was mostly about staying in touch with old friends, college classmates, co-workers from past jobs. But today, social media has become something much bigger. It's a place to discover new ideas, engage in important conversations, and connect with people in industries that we might not otherwise encounter. For agriculture, this has been a true gift and a challenge. On one hand, it offers farmers and ranchers the opportunity to speak directly to consumers, to share our stories, and to educate the public about where their food comes from. On the other hand, it has also opened the door to criticism, scrutiny, and widespread misinformation. Too often, we in agriculture find ourselves reacting instead of driving the conversation. That's why I'm especially excited about today's guest, someone who is using these platforms to be a powerful, proactive voice for agriculture. Natalie Kovarik is a fourth-generation cattle rancher, a passionate advocate, and the co-host of the Discover Ag podcast. Based in Nebraska, she's built a thriving online community by bringing authenticity, clarity, and a bit of humor to conversations about agriculture, food systems, and sustainability. She's helping reshape the public perception of rural life and giving consumers a reason to trust and appreciate the people behind their food. Together in this episode, we explore how Natalie found her voice in agriculture, how she utilizes storytelling in intentional ways to grow her platforms and build connections with the public, and her take on where agriculture communication is headed next. With that, I am excited to bring you my conversation with Natalie Kovarik. With that, it is my honor to welcome Natalie Kovarik to the podcast. Hello, Natalie.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Oh, it's our pleasure and honor to have you. We were hoping to meet and do this during the UC Davis Science Summit a couple weeks ago, but unfortunately you weren't able to make the trip out. So appreciate the plan B here of doing this via the web. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and your journey into agriculture advocacy?
Yeah, sure. I would love to. So like many in agriculture, I did grow up a little ranch kid. I grew up on a cattle ranch in Southwest Montana. Very much so a family operation. I actually have two sisters back on the ranch now. And growing up, we were involved in ranching. But I was never one of those kids that I would say was obsessed with cows and cattle. I just didn't see agriculture being a part of my life professionally. And my parents are okay with that. They actually encouraged, I have three older sisters, they encouraged all of us to go out and get degrees outside of agriculture. And so I did. I got my degree in pharmacy. And when I graduated, I did not move back to the family ranch. I actually moved to a larger city that was near our family ranch so I could spend a lot of time there and be near my family. But I was practicing as a full-time pharmacist and I was really loving my career. And I honestly thought that that is what I was going to do. Healthcare was very fulfilling to me. And so I just really never envisioned my life kind of being turned upside down. But then, tale as old as time, I met a man who was ranching in Nebraska and he kind of brought me full circle to agriculture. So, when we got married, I moved down to Nebraska, which is where we ranch now. And we're pretty rural. And so that kind of started my journey and my transition from pharmacy into, social sharer, I guess.
Are you close by the Nebraska Sandhills, as I understand it?
We are, yeah. Our ranch actually borders kind of the edge of it. So there are definitely a lot of other operations that are in the thick of the Sandhills, but I feel pretty blessed to have our ranch where we are. So our summer pasture is mostly, if not all, the grasslands, and then kind of our home base is, I wouldn't say it's the grasslands, but we run all of our summer cattle out on it.
Pretty unique and special place to be ranching.
Yeah, it's so funny. Growing up in Montana, I just never paid much attention to what was going on down in Nebraska. I remember meeting my husband and being like, wait, what state are you from again? Like, where is that at geographically? But yeah, it's a beautiful state. There's some really beautiful pockets of it. The Sandhills, for those listening that aren't familiar, take up a pretty large portion of Nebraska, and they are a really unique ecosystem there. I think they're actually ranked as like the world's largest, most intact ecosystem still, which is really, really cool. And they are that way because of a grazing animal. So it's pretty cool to kind of see the grasslands. Obviously, from a visual standpoint, it's really beautiful out at summer pasture, and we feel really blessed to be able to run our cattle there. But from just a management standpoint too, it's a really great area to run cattle. So we feel really blessed about that too.
So pharmacy, healthcare, back into agriculture in Nebraska. How did that bring you into advocacy, agricultural advocacy?
Yeah, quite the journey. My husband, when he married me, I think he just thought he was marrying a pharmacist, and, joke is on him because that is far from what I do today. It's a pretty wild world, I think, that our lives are. I never would have imagined it. I still do fill in. I still practice as a pharmacist. We ranch outside of a town of about 2,000, and there are 2 small independent pharmacies there, as well as a critical access hospital. So I'm kind of the town's like resident fill-in pharmacist. They know they can call me, and I can, cover shifts. And so I feel blessed that healthcare is still a part of my life from that aspect. But rewinding a little bit, when I moved down here, there were no pharmacy positions available. And I just hadn't, kind of created that fill-in position yet. And so when I relocated, I was kind of looking for something to do with my time. And I ended up deciding to start a direct-to-consumer beef business. And I did that with a childhood friend from back up Montana who was also on a ranch. And so we were really excited. And one of the first things we did was start a social media page. We knew that if we were going to sell our beef to people online and, kind of create a demand for the product that we were growing and raising, we would have to connect with our consumers and kind of storytell. And it felt very natural at that time. This was 2017, I think, to use social media to do that. And so a lot of brands were doing that. Agriculture was kind of dipping their toes into it. I feel like, social media have been shifting for quite some time from a more personal platform to seeing brands and businesses use it. And so we got to work right away and started sharing online. And that was kind of, I guess the beginning of the end, essentially, of what would become this new path forward for me, whether it was with the podcast or professional speaking or just sharing kind of our family story online.
How do you see that personal storytelling impacting the work you do, the work others are doing in agriculture? How important is that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think that times have evolved to pretty much make social media a standard part of our lives personally and professionally. And that stands for agriculture too. So, I think we probably all attended, one conference, if not many, that have talked about telling your story, and that if you aren't going to tell it, someone else is going to tell it for you. And as cliche and overheard as we have, probably heard that many times in the agriculture industry, it really is true. And, one of the reasons why I ended up shifting from that direct consumer beef business to just sharing more about agriculture online and kind of doing more advocacy work and less using social media from like a business standpoint of selling a product was because for so long, I feel like I had not been blind to like the misinformation online, but I just wasn't, I guess I just wasn't aware of it. You only know what you know. And growing up in small town rural Montana and then, moving to small town rural Nebraska, both kind of states that are, I would say agriculture centered, or agriculture at least plays a large, portion of the economy in both of the states. I feel like I was never really exposed to the pockets of population that are, completely removed from agriculture, maybe ones that have very negative misconceptions of agriculture, or ones that are just being fed misinformation unknowingly. And so when I started seeing that, when I was sharing, for the beef page, the direct consumer beef business, I started seeing all this misinformation or just all these dialogues, all these questions. And that's when I kind of was, encouraged to shift from that business to the personal sharing. But it really is true. There's a lot of information out there that's being shared. And it really does take, the people within the industry who feel called and compelled to share to kind of put our story out there so that at least there is, for the people that want to do the due diligence to kind of look for environmental information or nutritional information or animal welfare information when it comes to their shopping, there are people sharing about it. And the second thing I'll say that I think is really important too is I think there's a huge movement with consumers right now to get information closest from the source they can. I just talked about kind of that shift of social media where we are using it for our information. We're so connected on it, right? Like, you could find stat after stat about the Gen Z population and how, they're no longer consuming facts and information from news or TV. Now they're getting it from TikTok and Twitter. And so I think that we went through this phase as a society where there was almost information overload, and that was both factual information and misinformation. And consumers are getting, I think, really tired of the gimmicks and the game and the branding and the just some of the lies and I don't know, some of the games that marketing can go through with them. And so they're really looking for a very direct source for their questions. And I feel like that's such an opportune time for people in agriculture to be able to step up to the plate and give that information for consumers.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And one of the things that I see more and more of in social media comes from the product marketers, whether that's beef or other animal products, proteins. And you can tell these aren't ranchers, and they get a little irritated with me because I'm not usually shy about telling them they're not ranchers, because some of the rhetoric that they use, ranchers would never use. And they're perpetuating those same lies, for lack of a better term, or giving them the benefit of the doubt, misinformation. But talking about aspects that just are not true, to demonize other producers just so that they can sell a product. And that is a big problem, I think, in the industry.
Yeah, for sure. And unfortunately, the consumers are the ones that get caught in the middle of it. We talk about this quite a bit on our podcast, Discover Ag, because it's so prevalent now. But the greenwashing and the marketing when it comes to, these food labels we're seeing on different products and claims, a lot of marketing now is just that. As you've mentioned, it's not really being upheld. It's not being monitored. The USDA isn't monitoring it. The FDA isn't monitoring it. There's so many claims that just a marketer has put on a package of product to get one consumer to buy it over the other. And I just, at the end of the day, it's the consumer who really loses, along with the producer who really loses. So it's been cool, I think, to come out of that transition where the wool is kind of being lifted over everyone's eyes and consumers are starting to ask for, like, should I really pay for a product that says naturally raised? Like, what does that actually mean? Is my dollar going somewhere? And having those conversations that matter. So the end of the day, they can go into the grocery store and pick the product that best serves them and the intentions for their household, while also minimizing, their pockets financially.
What are some of the top myths or misinformation statements that you see?
Yeah, I think it ebbs and flows, like conversations around food, which always makes being a part of them kind of exciting. When we started our podcast 3 years ago, I feel like environmental questions and concerns were like on the forefront of all consumers. One cool thing about podcasting is like today, you get asked to go on other podcasts when you're kind of a podcaster. It's like this, you enter the small world of podcasting and it's like, how can we have conversations together? And so when we launched, we actually were reached out to by a ton of podcasts that was super cool that were kind of like in the food, maybe exercise, kind of that like health adjacent world that was like talking about food. But they were, wellness experts or nutrition, dietitians, doctors who had podcasts. And so they weren't really like experts in farming. And so they wanted to have people on to have food and farming conversations. And we were kind of, excitingly the go-to. And so the questions we were being asked then by all those podcasts that had an interest in food but didn't know much about them, I felt were environmentally focused. And so that was when we would have a lot of the conversations about like, carbon footprints and methane reduction and all the things that they were caring about as consumers when it came to, sourcing food that had minimal climate impact, or like at least what that looked like. Like, break this down. Is this real or not? And honestly, I feel like we've kind of evolved out of that. And I would say like right now, especially with like the MAHA movement, everything that happened over 2020, the end of 2024 and kind of 2025 now, I feel like we've shifted to a lot of like nutrition. And people have a lot of questions about like, protein and whole food and fillers and preservatives. And so I feel like it's almost an entirely different conversation we're having now. And misconceptions have gone from like methane reduction and carbon footprint and having those kind of conversations to now like, what is a preservative? Is, this food really going to kill you? What does glyphosate mean? And it's just very different conversations that we're happy to combat, like with the misinformation.
One thing that I've noticed is if I see a post from somebody that just shows up in a feed, and if I like it or laugh at it or be angry at it, whatever response that I may click on, all of a sudden now I've got a bunch of other similar type posts that I may not have an interest in, but now they're coming forward, and it's showing that the volume of stuff that's out there, right or wrong. How do those algorithms impact your work and your messaging? What's the role that they play, good or bad?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because it is so true. And I feel like that's another thing we actually talk about on our podcast quite a bit too, is nowadays you can basically find or curate your feed to fit your narrative almost. Or, the choice you want to make or the outlook you have. It's like, as you mentioned, you click like, consume one piece of content, all of a sudden you have 10 more that are just like it there to kind of validate that original, question you had or preconceived notion you had. And it's kind of dangerous, truthfully, because you can find anything to support your stance. And I think that's why we're seeing kind of some of these more, like heated discussions and conversations around food, because people will, find one study to cite their opinion that, glyphosate is bad or meat is bad or whatever it is. And then someone else can find one study to kind of support the opposite. And so I feel like it nowadays more than ever, again, it goes back to, unfortunately, a little bit of the consumer having to do our own work when it comes to food of, looking beyond the headlines, looking beyond, the 4 pieces you got sent and really asking yourself, okay, like, what does it look like beyond this conversation having here? Is there truth to it? Is there bias to it? One thing we talk a lot about, like in the wellness industry, is that they might, shy away from conventional practices or conventional methods. But at the same time, they are still promoting and asking their followers to buy something from them that falls under, the quote unquote natural camp. And so I'm like, there's still incentive for them. It's still a business to kind of promote this alternative method. And so again, I think we're kind of in the messy middle of it where we're going to come out and consumers are just going to want more clarity, more, direct conversations about what is the intent behind this for you? What studies are you citing? How biased is this? I just think it's going to help kind of weed out some of those misinformation conversations, because consumers really are, again, getting tired of like that misinformation overload.
What are the tricks to the trade that you use to bridge that knowledge gap or an information gap between ranchers, the public, the academics? Are there any secrets that you employ?
Yeah, I think one thing that's always stuck with me when it comes to like having conversations is people don't necessarily always want to hear what they need to hear. And so you have to learn to have conversations and deliver information, like package it in a way that they, want to consume it. And so you're almost giving them what they need in a way that they want it. And that's one thing that we have tried really hard to do with our podcast, Discover Ag, is have, informational conversations but do them in a lighthearted way that feels like you can tune in and you're not tuning into like an educational 101 episode, like you're not back in school or something. And so we found kind of what works for us is like melding agriculture and pop culture. And so we'll try and take these trending events that everyday people see in the news and talk about and consume, scrolling social media, that maybe they can relate to or, they're familiar with. And then again, package some of that agriculture information in those lighthearted kind of pop culture moments so that people can, again, feel like they're getting the information, but serve to them in a way that feels, entertaining, in a way they want to consume it and spend their time consuming it.
I'm sure you have some idea with all the data that's out there, but in your audience, do you have a breakdown of how many are in agriculture and how many are in general public?
No, it's really, really hard to tell, especially with podcasting, the back end. As you guys probably know, the back end information is a little bit more limited than even some of the other social platforms. So we can tell through direct conversations, obviously, of, what people kind of respond to different. So the way our podcast is structured is we cover like usually four of the top trending articles in the food, agriculture, Western culture space that week. And so depending on what we talk about in the different articles, you can kind of tell where people fall in the spectrum of like super close to their food, production agriculture, or, very removed from their food, complete consumer in a urban area, by how they kind of respond, or maybe their questions they had to us that week from the podcast. And so that's our best gauge. I will say that like when we launched the podcast, Tara and I had both been respectively sharing, sorry, Tara's my co-host. She's a dairy farmer from New Mexico. So we had both been respectively kind of sharing in some agriculture heavy spaces, right? Dairy, meat. And the core of our audience we kind of started with the podcast was definitely production agriculture and those within the industry. But, over 3 years now, it's really safe to say that we have definitely grown and we've hit in, the outer circles of the bullet as you move away from food. And so we've moved into a lot of ag ally industry, people who are maybe in college, professors teaching, students going to college, teaching agriculture, learning agriculture, and even moved out to the complete outer circle of people just shopping in the grocery store. So it's been really fun to see that like growth evolve for Discover Ag of the different people tuning in and why they're tuning in.
You mentioned Discover Ag now a couple times. Can you tell us what led up to the creation of that effort?
Again, very accidental, which is like the story of my online journey. So I could have never planned any of these as good as they were if I had, planned them. So I had met Tara. Like I said, she had been sharing online kind of in the dairy space. She did a lot of keynote speaking on dairy sustainability. She's actually an environmental scientist by trade. And so a lot of that was very obviously natural to her. And she also carried a passion for the dairy industry. And so we kind of connected online just as a dairy wife and cattle ranching wife and two people sharing their families kind of online. And out of that, really quickly realized that we had maybe big picture visions and missions of how we wanted to talk about agriculture and position agriculture. And so we ended up creating our podcast out of just an online friendship, which feels like very millennial 2020 to say.
How do you choose the topics? Do you get feedback from listeners? Do they make suggestions, or you mentioned the top 4 issues that you see in the food realm every week? How does that selection play out?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Honestly, when we started the podcast, we were really nervous about that because we knew we didn't want a podcast that like centered on ourselves. Like we didn't, there are a lot of podcasts like that. You tune in and it's kind of like hanging out with, girlfriends, and it's very personal content. And we did not want that. Although we do want people to tune in and feel like, they're chit-chatting about food and farming with their girlfriends. But that's why we came up with the idea of the trending news, and kind of circling back to some conversation before this. We were just tired of seeing people talking about agriculture that, weren't supposed to be leading food conversations, whether that was a wellness influencer that was maybe, getting a little out of their lane talking about farming practices or, what have it. We can all think of an image of someone where they heard someone talking about agriculture online in a capacity that they, probably weren't meant to lead that conversation. And so we thought, well, if, we're tired of other people talking about food and farming, and we know we want to continue to share our mission and love for connecting people with food, why don't we talk about food and farming? And so we kind of came up with that idea for kind of the top news pieces. And we were really worried at first that we were like, gosh, what if like we don't have something to talk about every week? Like, what if there's nothing trending in the food and news space? And it's so funny because now we kind of just throughout the week, we have we joined like a data platform, an organization space online where we dump all the different articles or different reels or, podcasts we see throughout the week, and we dump them into one space. And then kind of at the end of the week, we weed through them and pick our top articles. And some weeks we will have like 15 or 20 to pick from when we're only going to talk about 4 of them. And so it's been really cool to see. And I think it was enlightening for us to obviously see how much at the forefront food conversations are. And then, since we've grown, our discos kind of handle it now for us. That's what our listeners call themselves, our discos. And we will hop into Instagram, which is kind of one of our main platforms for connecting with them. And I'll jump into the DMs and we will have, 10 discos that week who sent us an article that they were like, hey, we would love your opinions on this, or we saw this and thought of Discover Ag. And so it's really cool to kind of have that interaction with our listeners too, because now we know that what we're talking about is what they want to tune into. You kind of can guess that at the beginning, but when you get sent an article, especially when you get sent it multiple times, you're like, yep, okay, this belongs in the lineup this week. This is what the discos want to hear and talk about.
Yeah, I can't imagine there's any shortage whatsoever of potential topics. One, you just on one of your most recent discussions was an influencer talking about carrots not being food. And you look at that and you go, this is ridiculous.
It's just a wild world we live in, I tell you.
You talk about telling the stories. And I guess I'm one of those that you referred to that overuses the, if you don't tell it ourselves, it'll be told for us. So now I'm not going to use that anymore because now giving me a complex. But
no, it's true. It's true. Keep saying it.
But it is true. And, we produced a documentary this last couple of years. You just can't see them from the road, where we showcase 5 ranching families or 5 ranches in the state of California, 4 in which we have conservation easements, and 1 we're trying to get an easement on that ranch for that family. And the success of that documentary in the film festival circuits, we've been in 30 of them, 15 awards, which is, I think, just tells a lot about the success of telling our story and them telling their stories, I should say. And we touch on some of the misinformation and bad rap that livestock get out there. And it's been a good film. We're trying to get that out to larger audiences now that we're out of the film festival circuit. So hopefully we can get it on some sort of streaming service. So if Mr. Bezos, if you're listening to this, we would feel free to get.
I'm sure he is.
And we'd love to chat with you. But it's that importance of of folks telling the stories. And as you know, a lot of ranchers and farmers don't tell those stories. They tend to be more private. But at least I think we're starting to see that next generation I think it's because of social media and the ease of telling stories. Pick up your cell phone, show it around. That's what my daughter does all the time. She just will be riding her horse and she'll turn the video on and has a little bit of commentary for 30 seconds. And I think that's really broadening folks' view of what we're doing as producers out there.
I have a couple different keynotes that talk about this. Usually this gets weaved into each and every one of them in kind of the same context, but it's pretty wild. If I had told, my grandpa who started our family ranch back in Montana, or even my great grandpa that, homesteaded there before him, that one day in agriculture, we would have this marketing tool at our disposal that is 100% free for us to use and allows us the capability to reach not just every state nationwide, but globally, anyone across the entire world. And you're talking, millions of people that you could reach for free to share our story. Like you said, straight from the saddle or straight from, the tractor cab. I think I don't know if they could comprehend that is a tool that has been placed in the agriculture laps. Like, what a gift. And so it is pretty cool to see. I'm not one of those people that recommends every single person get online. I would never encourage anyone who didn't feel comfortable to share online, because I do think you kind of, there are things that come with it. And I think it is a job. It does require time and effort and some skills too, right? Like it's a pretty saturated market online now. And so, you have to kind of be savvy at what you're doing. And so I think it's a calling for certain people within agriculture. And it is cool to see, those younger people come up into the ranks and kind of start sharing online and kind of take off and have some success with it. Cause I do think it moves the needle with our industry in a lot of different ways, with the film, which congratulations, super cool. But it is, it is so interesting. I think we have this idea of what we need to talk about when it comes to sharing our story, that what we need to talk about agriculture. It's like these certain bullet points that we feel are what the consumer wants to hear. But it's really cool actually to kind of see what resonates with consumers and be able to share different things that I just don't even think that they are even aware of. Like if you had told people who were concerned about, the climate impact of cattle, that we have people like Frank Mitloner, at UC Davis leading 3-day conferences where they talk solely about methane and all of the different science and studies and back end things that are taking place to just curb methane reduction. I just don't think people are aware that that's even going on. And so sometimes it's just cool to kind of peel back the layer a little bit and say like, hey, this is what's going on. You're probably not even aware of it. Like these are the things we're doing with the agriculture. These are the degrees we have. These are the, the advancements, the technology we have that I think people just can't even comprehend to begin to think about.
No, folks think that livestock, animal agriculture is destroying the earth. And we don't need them. We can create our food in a lab. We don't need ranchers. We don't need cows. We don't need sheep or goats. What you pick it. And that philosophy, the flip side of this, of the social media is that other story is being told too. And folks are falling for that. And the role that you play in others of saying, no, wait, here's the truth here. We have to have these grazing animals out there to protect the land and the ecosystem that comes from that. We lose 2,000 acres a day of farm and ranch land in the United States. A day. That we can't continue to survive at that kind of rate. I know in Montana, particularly since Yellowstone's popularity, the land grab in Montana is a big one. I assume you've got stories in Nebraska as well. California, we're on track to lose 747,000 acres by 2040. So that type of loss, where do you see that impacting the family farms and ranches that you represent, that you're talking to, that all of us are trying to work to protect?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We actually just covered this on our podcast. I think this episode we're talking on now is going to be released mid-June. So the podcast episode that we talked about on Discover Ag is actually beginning of June. I think it was that Thursday, June, what is that, the 5th, right around there. We talk about this because there was a reel that kind of popped off and went viral on social media of a young girl who just recently got into homesteading and is having quite success sharing on her page about how to acquire land as a young person and how to basically, build a homestead or a very, very small farm if you're interested. And she's quite popular. She does a really good job at sharing, the different messages and content she creates. And there was this collaboration between her reel and a kind of business, financial, money-making creator that has, over 1 million followers. So very, very large account. And together they were talking about the great, land grab, essentially, that's going to take place. And land transfer, I think, is a better way to say it than grab. But that's going to take place over the next, 10, 20 years when we see the land shift from boomers who are, one of the larger shareholders of agriculture land right now and to that next generation, and just the opportunity there. One, maybe for people to come in, but two, like you said, what does that happen when we see that land actually, move out of production and into, residential building or commercial uses or whatever it is, non-food production uses. And I think it's a two-edged sword. I think it's really frustrating. There's a lot of small farmers that can't compete at land prices to be able to keep the farming in the family business. There's estate taxes you deal with when it makes it nearly impossible to as well. You deal with, as you mentioned, competitors, policy, things I think California probably deals with a little bit more than we do here in Nebraska. But feels like there's a lot of forces against people in agriculture to keep ag land in ag land, especially to keep family farming without scaling that into, larger production. But at the same note, you have people like that reel that were talking about how do we, keep farmland, and here are the things we can do. And so it feels like there's just kind of this collision of what people want versus the reality of where we are at in a society. And it'll be interesting to see it play out. Hopefully it's, for better and not worse. And we don't see, as you mentioned, this land evolve out of food production because we need it. We're already having, we have a lot of challenges in agriculture every single day to make food. And so, one we don't need to continue to battle with is less and less land to do it.
Nebraska Land Trust and the Montana Land Reliance are two organizations working in Montana and Nebraska, obviously, that are partners with the California Rangeland Trust in our partnership of rangeland trusts, which is 9 organizations that are statewide working to help give ranchers and farmers a tool to keep those ranchers and farmers on those lands and keep them in production. Those are collectively, Port has well over 3 million acres in those, actually it's 12 states permanently protected. So we're trying to do our part, but again, having folks recognize that and understand the importance of these, the biodiversity, the climate resilience, and all of the culture that these lands provide, in addition to local food and fiber and food security.
Yep.
We've seen a resurgence of popularity in ag and Western culture. Some of that can be attributed to Yellowstone and other similar programs. Where do you see this popularity coming from? And how does that positively or even negatively impact the industry?
Yeah, Yellowstone, never heard of it. Never heard of it at all. No, it is so interesting to look at the Yellowstone effect. I'm not sure if there was a kind of a resurgence right before it, but I do think Yellowstone amazingly enough, did play a really large role in it. That film just really captivated people and kind of re-brought them back around to, Western culture and what, agriculture stood for a very long time. I also think, COVID obviously played a huge role. Like if we're getting out of a little bit of Western culture and more into like the food world, that was, I think, a huge moment for people to kind of pause and reflect on, what do I know about my food? What questions do I have about my food? What do I know about farmers and ranchers and how food actually goes from the field into the grocery store? And so I think that moment was definitely a huge resurgence for people's interest. And then oddly enough, RFK Jr. and everything he's done with MAHA, whether you agree with it or disagree with it or somewhere in the middle, I do think he's done an amazing job of, again, opening up the doors and conversation for people that really want to connect back to their food. We covered it on the podcast. I'll never forget when he did his resignation speech. I thought it was fascinating to me that, he had however long, 40 minutes up there on a stage, absolutely commanding probably a majority of people in the United States at that moment, watching him, tuning into his speech. And he chose to talk about food and health. And I just thought, wow, I haven't, at least in my time, from the content I consumed from a, president or a presidential candidate at the time, seeing them talk about food in that capacity. And I remember just clicking with me and thinking, this is the start of something really, really big, because there is no way that we will have a presidential candidate spend that much time talking about food and farming and health and not have it turn into something that affects our landscape. And so, we've had kind of this accumulation of whether it's Yellowstone or RFK Jr. and MAHA or wellness influencers. I mean, they were a huge portion of people sharing online is kind of in the wellness space. And so, wherever that comes from, it is definitely peeling over, and we are getting more and more interest in food and Western culture. And I think that's really cool to have people's attention in an industry. Attention is what we want. And so, it comes with its drawbacks. You'll get some wild questions or some, whatever comes with, people being completely removed, trying to dip their toes back into these industries. But overall, I think it's a huge benefit to our industry, and hopefully we can continue to capitalize off of the interest in the conversations and kind of make it to a point where we are just reconnected, right? You think back, how many ever decades ago when we were just connected to food and farming, and that was just the way society was, where we didn't have questions because we were connected. Maybe we can circle back around, and in 10, 15 years, there won't be those pockets of questions and misinformation and gaps, because we'll just be like reconnected again.
Where do you see the future of ag communications? You've talked about it kind of evolved just on your front, where you started off with agriculture and producers, and then growing that audience into others that are, you say, food adjacent. Where do you see the future of ag comms going?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll definitely stick in the world of media, right? I just think we've evolved into that. Again, I already talked about it a little bit, but the generations behind me, they are not looking at magazines, unfortunately, much anymore. They're hardly turning on the TV. They're definitely not, listening to the news. And so I think communications will kind of remain the forefront of consumer driven around the different social media apps. It is interesting. I was listening to a marketing podcast the other day that was talking about just the ebbs and flows of different social media platforms and the success they have had to market, whether it's a product, I guess, or a story, essentially in our case. And it's interesting to hear them kind of see an ebb and flow in the different ways that it has worked through social media. Instagram ads worked for a while and then they didn't, and podcasting ads worked for a while and then they didn't. And so it'll be kind of interesting to see what the next, we haven't had a major social media app kind of take route. We've had the main 4 ones for a while now. You think of YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter are kind of the dominant ones. And so I don't know if we'll see a new communication mode come out within the next 10, 15, 20 years. That's a really long time span. And with how quickly technology changes, I would imagine we'd see something else come out that kind of, snaps and takes over consumers' attention, which would kind of be, the newest way to market and have these conversations when it comes to communicating. But I do think for now, at least for my foreseeable future of, how I'll be spending my time communicating, whether that's with people within the industry or people without of it, it's definitely in the online world of social media.
What advice do you have for those that want to become ag advocates like yourself?
Yeah. Where to start? I think the best advice I have is do it, which is a pretty cliche one you probably heard before. But it's kind of a weird, world. I used to be able to say I'm a pharmacist, and now when people ask what I do, it's like I don't really know what to say I do. So I think there's a lot of kind of mental things that can hold people back from wanting to share online, whether it's like fear of judgment or like what will their friends and family think, or why do I even have the expertise to hop online and share this? And so I think to battle through kind of all that mental sludge and just go for it is kind of my first advice, because you obviously will never get anywhere if you don't get started. And then after that, I would kind of make a strategic game plan. I do think a lot of people look at like people who share online and think it's like, what an easy job, like what an easy thing to do. You just open your phone and talk to them, and then you have all this success. And there's a lot more that goes into it. So I think if you could, find a mentor or someone else who shares online, or, join a group. There's so many ways to educate now, whether it's like YouTube platforms that just watching people's YouTube videos talking about how to share online, or actually finding groups and communities that are doing it. That way you can kind of, learn from people who have been doing it and kind of put your best foot forward so that you can kind of see some of that more immediate success with sharing. Because there is a lot of strategy to it, and there is a lot you can learn to be able to share in a more successful manner. And so I would just get started, and then I would make a little game plan for yourself.
Natalie, that sounds like great advice. You are a living example of how someone can start off on one path and pivot and take on a whole new role in ag communications. And you've been very successful at that. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. And where can listeners participate and listen to Discover Ag?
Yeah, I'm just so sorry we once again didn't get to do this in person. It's always fun. Podcasting is such a virtual space. It's always fun when you can actually sit down with someone and podcast face to face. So my apologies about that. But if you're tuning into this, you are probably somewhat of a podcast person. So you can hop over in whatever podcast listening app you use, whether it's Spotify, Apple, or something else, and search for Discover Ag and find our podcast there. Our cover images, myself and my co-host were, head to toe in denim, and I'm holding a chicken and she has a hot dog. So when you find that image, you have found the right podcast. And every Thursday we dive into the top, usually four or five topics in Western culture, food, and agriculture with the pop culture twist. And it is equal parts information and entertaining. So we have a lot of fun over there. And then if you're a social media person, I'm just under my name, Natalie Kovarik, on Instagram is kind of my main platform. I also dabble in X sometimes, and I'm pretty prevalent on LinkedIn as well.
Natalie, the Discover Ag podcast is great. I've listened to a number of episodes and really enjoyed them. You've done an amazing job of telling ag story to not only those in the ag field, but those food adjacent audiences that you talk about. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Yes, it was fun chatting.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Natalie Kovarik. As she shared, you can tune in to the Discover Ag podcast, co-hosted with Tara Vanderdusen, on your favorite streaming platform. And be sure to follow Natalie on social media at Natalie Kovarik to keep up with her work. That closes a gate on another episode of Tune Into the Land. We want to remind you that your feedback matters. Share your thoughts by leaving a comment or review. Let us know what you enjoyed, what topics you'd like us to dig into, and your suggestions for future guests. Don't forget to hit that follow button to ensure you're notified when the next episode drops. And if you'd like to support our mission, visit our website at rangelandtrust.org. There you can make a donation or check out the Get Involved tab to learn more about upcoming events and conservation projects. Thank you for listening, and until next time.